The wait is up. The long hours of negotiations have borne fruit. Iran and the P5+1 have reached the much anticipated common understanding on all outstanding issues in the way of a final nuclear agreement. In this edition of the debate, we discuss the parameters that have been agreed upon, what this means in a wider context, and how far we are now from that final agreement as drafting begins. Let me start off by introducing our guest. Joining us from Washington is expert at Wikistrat, Richard Waits, and also joining us from Washington is American historian and investigative journalist Gareth Porter. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on Press TV. Mr. Porter, I'd like to start off with you, if I may. If you've listened to the press conference outlining this common understanding, is this that win-win scenario that the Iranian administration was looking for?
I think it's very difficult to unpack the terms of this and give a definitive answer to who won and who lost in the negotiations. But certainly, it's in the interests of both sides to have kept the negotiations going and to have arrived at least the outlines of an agreement. However, I have to add that there are still issues that are unresolved, which I'm not saying that there are deal breakers, but they're clearly not over the last hurdles yet to arrive at a final agreement. So bottom line, yes, both sides will benefit from this. It is a win-win solution, even if the agreement is not yet complete.
Well, can you elaborate a bit more on that, Mr. Porter? What does that mean, even if the agreement is not achieved at the end, a final agreement? How does any side come out as a winner?
No, what I said was that there are still issues that are unresolved. I think they're important issues. Specifically, the one that I have been focusing on in recent days is the issue of lifting sanctions. And I think this is an issue that the Iranians have been bargaining very, very hard on. The United States has refused to give up the demand, as I understand it, to keep in place the architecture of sanctions, meaning the legal and bureaucratic apparatus of sanctions until the very end of this 10-year initial period of the agreement, or even beyond that. And that is what I think is unacceptable to Iran for quite understandable reasons. So I think that is an issue that still must be resolved, and therefore, one cannot say that they have completed the negotiations.
Well, Mr. Porter, if, and I say if, these sanctions are lifted as being presented to us right now by Mogherini and by Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, do you think this will be the end of Iran's nuclear file, though?
No, it certainly is not the end of the nuclear file. On the contrary, this agreement, as it stands at the moment, will subject Iran to not just one, but a couple of processes that it has to come out at the end with a favorable judgment, on which it has to have a favorable judgment from the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that process will take years unless the negotiators come up with a different conclusion from what the United States is now proposing. That's why I've suggested that this is an issue that still remains to be resolved, and therefore, this question of whether the Iranian file can be safely said to now be on its way to being quickly resolved, one cannot say that yet at this moment.
All right, let me bring in Mr. Waits. Like I said, he was an expert at Wikistrat, and he joins us from Washington as well. Mr. Waits, first of all, your initial reactions to this common understanding?
The terms seem within the parameters what we expected. I don't think it's going to arouse any stronger opposition or support than what we've seen before. Of course, this is just a framework agreement, so the technical details remain to be resolved. But certainly some of the terms look good, like the Iraq nuclear reactor. They seem to have solved that one. But again, these are more statement of principles, and now the hard part comes when they work out precisely what are the technical parameters, what Iran can do, what the foreign community can do, and that will be difficult. But I'm glad to see we got a framework agreement.
So, Mr. Waits, I think both of you gentlemen do agree that from now to June end deadline, there's a long way to go for both parties to reach that final joint plan of action. However, one thing that is being highlighted over and over again is the removal of the sanctions, and we're just talking with Mr. Porter here about whether that can be achieved or not, in principle at least. Do you think that will happen, specifically considering how we have seen in the past that when it's not the nuclear issue, then Iran has been subject to sanctions over some other excuse?
Right. The sanctions, I mean, there are a lot of countries that are sanctioning Iran for a lot of reasons, and many of them are related to the nuclear issue. So I suspect that you'll see Russia, China, India, many countries will follow the lead of whatever the UN agrees to. So if the UN recoils of the 4 sanctioning resolutions, if it starts removing some of them, I think that will be fully implemented. The US is probably sanctioning Iran more than anybody, and that's going to be difficult. Some of the sanctions President Obama can remove simply by executive action. Some he may be able to not enforce. But there's some that require congressional action, and that's going to be really hard to gain, because, at least in the current Congress. So Iran might have to accept that not all sanctions will be removed from the U.S. side, but a lot of them will be removed from other countries, and that may serve as adequate compensation.
Mr. Porter, will that be a favorable outcome, at least as far as Iran is concerned?
Well, look, the Iranians are, if nothing else, quite realistic about the American political system with which they are dealing in these negotiations, and they understand that the best they can bargain for in this situation is to get the suspension of the sanctions that have to do with oil and banking that have been imposed by the United States and the EU unilaterally. And the present agreement, the framework agreement, if you will, does provide for that suspension of those sanctions, and that's an extremely important gain for Iran, no question about it. Even though it is a suspension, the framework of the sanctions still remains in place. There's always the possibility of their being reimposed on the basis of some political judgment by the IAEA or by the United States or its allies. And so they're not out of the woods by any means, but it does represent a significant gain. I think that they're ready to settle for that on the understanding that if and when Iran complies with specific components of the agreement, particular provisions of the agreement that are not easily reversible, that take years and years to reverse, would take years to reverse, that they then be compensated by not just suspension, but actual removal, permanent lifting of sanctions that have been imposed. That's, as I understand it, one of the remaining issues.
Right, Mr. Waits, I'd like to bring you on this when it comes to sanctions, because it seems that President Barack Obama believes the only reason Iran sat at the negotiating table was because of the sanctions. Now, if the U.S. continues with that mentality, will it ever have that incentive to lift those sanctions?
Well, that's a very good question. There are many people who argue, well, some sanctions made Iran make some concessions, so more sanctions will make Iran make more concessions. But I think that, as Mr. Porter and many others know, this will probably not hold true in all cases. I think the sanction issue is peaked. I really think that they've been fading in intensity. I mean, I haven't seen many new sanctions come online recently. You see relaxation, and I think this will just continue that momentum. Again, the key, from the point of view of the Iranians, they shouldn't think, well, how many sanctions is the U.S. going to remove? They should think, if just the U.S. Treasury doesn't go around to India or South Korea or all these countries and threaten them deny them access to the U.S. banking system if they trade with Iran, if they stop doing that, that will give Iran a tremendous benefit. Regardless of what the U.S. does with many of its sanctions, because there's just not much economic relationship between Iran and the U.S. in any case. I think the Iranians should look more towards key partners that want to work with Iran economically, but are afraid of getting entangled in the U.S. Treasury's sanctions, which will be relaxed through this agreement.
I see you agreeing there, Mr. Porter, but Mr. Wade, stay with me on this if you can. Iran clearly doesn't see it that way, because let's not forget there is a lack of trust between the two sides. And we just heard Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif speak to reporters in Lausanne, speaking of how Iran does not want to fall for those excuses that have been made in the past, which have violated previous agreements. Let's not forget the November 2013 agreement that was signed between Iran, Turkey, and Brazil on the behest of the U.S., and then the U.S. pulled out at the last minute. Now, Iran wouldn't want to agree to something and then wait over the years to see if the U.S. will respond positively. It will want simultaneous confidence-building measures, wouldn't it?